Kevin MacDonell is from Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia. He also is the author of the CoolData blog, which you can read at CoolData.org. It's actually kind of neat, the kind of stuff he writes about and whatnot. So he's going to talk about some of the really fascinating things that he does and works with. Kind of relates to his work at Dalhousie as well as what he writes about on CoolData, and I'll let him introduce himself a little bit.
Sure. Thank you. It might be rank amateurs, but so far I would say the conference is very professionally run. I've been to quite a few, and kudos. It's working really well. I work at Dalhousie. I'm an annual giving officer, and I run the Phonathon program. I've only been in annual giving for about a year and a half, so I have actually quite a lot to learn about annual giving. It's been a steep learning curve, and I'm still on that curve. But I'm getting better every day. What else should I say about myself? I also do data analysis for all areas of fundraising at Dalhousie, so major gifts, planned giving, as well as annual fund. I'm in a unique situation in Phonathon in that I create predictive models, and I'm also the end user. So this is a very good situation to be in. It means that I'm really busy, but at the same time it means I have control over how my models are actually used. I've created models for major giving and planned giving that I go back 6 months later and say, how are you using those scores anyway? And they'll say, well, we actually haven't done anything with them. So if a model is not actually used, if it's not, if it doesn't lead to some sort of action, then you could say that it's a failed model. Anyway, so I guess at certain times a year I'm 60-40, doing analysis 40% of the time, 60% of the time I'm working as a fundraiser. Once upon a time, data was scarce. It was difficult to acquire. Calculations were done by hand. A lot of the statistical tools that we use were actually invented or created for use with manual calculation. And it's amazing that we still use those tools today, and they still work really well. But today it's a totally different situation. We have computers to do all of the calculations for us. At no time has there ever been such power on our desktops to do the analysis that we can do. And I like to think of data as sort of we're swimming in data. We've never had so much data to work with. Incoming students now, I know not everybody here is higher ed, but we're collecting more data than ever before. And so I like to think of as data as sort of a plural noun. It's almost like a liquid. We're sort of swimming in it, rather than the old concept of data, which was to think of it as a plural. So these data are different. But that's a grammatical thing, which, is there anybody here who says data are rather than data is? Okay, well, we can argue about that later. So, is datum still actually a word that anybody uses? I don't know. Dalhousie University has about 100,000 living alumni, about 17,000 full-time students. So yesterday I had a wonderful opportunity to meet with staff from various offices at the University of Washington and discovered how things are done on a totally different scale. It was quite an eye-opener. I learned an awful lot, and I really appreciate the opportunity to meet with people for most of the day yesterday, including visiting the Phonathon room, which was a real treat. Interesting to see how we do things in a similar way, but on a different scale. We have 30 students employed in the Phonathon room, and of course the University of Washington has 75?
75 employed,
yeah.
30 on a shift.
30 on a shift, yeah, so it was wonderful. As I said, I'm in my second year doing the Phonathon program, and I write the CoolData blog in my spare time. So CoolData, WordPress.org. Now I also have CoolData, WordPress.com. CoolData.org is also another way to get there. There should be plenty of time for questions, but just interrupt me at any point if you want to find out more. I want to start with a story. These are actual callers from my program from last year, except for that guy on the top. I don't have a clue who that guy is. He just showed up because he was paid for 2 hours. So this is like beer money right here. The others are valued members of my team. They were last year. We hired a new caller named Jade. She's not in this picture. And normally in a phone-a-thon program, what you will do is new callers, while they're just getting experience, their first calls to alumni, well, we might do thank you calling or event calling. That's one way to introduce them to get them comfortable with the automated calling system and coding and so on. But when they actually start asking for donations, they talk to acquisition prospects. So they'll talk to non-donors, maybe young alumni, calling pools where there's no risk of actually leaving money on the table. So, just get them comfortable with that. So Jade was actually speaking with a fellow who is an acquisition prospect, as close as you can get to being a non-donor. And she did as she was trained to do. She left a comment for me because she encountered a difficulty with one person that she was speaking with. This person told her that he had a wonderful time at Dalhousie, his student experience was great, and he would like to make a gift. But she was unable to enter the dollar figure into Campus Call, which is our automated system. And I have a $10,000 limit in Campus Call. That's where I set it. It's fairly arbitrary because you never think it's never going to happen. So the next morning I see in my comment report this person, she wasn't able to leave the dollar amount, so immediately I go to the database and find out who is this person, to discover that he was actually a major gift prospect. He had been sitting in a portfolio for 1.5 years and had never been contacted. The only reason he was called so early in the year was because he had a very high propensity to give score in my phone-a-thon model. That person actually ended up making a major gift to the university. The internal, once I alerted Major Gifts that this might be an opportunity, it became internally known as the Jade Project, sort of a little joke. But here's the facts about her donor. Graduated in the 1970s, made only a single gift, $20 in 1983. But as I say, he had a very high propensity to give score, so we called him in September. And it just so happened, actually, he lives he's an anonymous donor, so I can't say anything more, but lives on the West Coast, and he's actually the CEO of a company, and that's the only way that she actually managed to. It was a very long call because she went through many layers of assistance and so on before she persisted on the call. She's an excellent employee. That person ended up making a gift of $1 million to the Faculty of Management, which also happens to be Jade's faculty. She's a business student, commerce student. So, huge success story for Jade. Huge success story for the phone-a-thon program for annual giving, although we can't count that $1 million towards our total. Still, I do have a great story to tell about Jade. And I also think it's also a success story for analytics at Dalhousie. An outlier $1 million gift in phone-a-thon is not really proof that data analytics works, but it is a good story. So I want to focus on 3 main themes in my talk today. First of all, predictive modeling, what the heck is it? What do I use it for? And specifically, I'll focus on the phone-a-thon program. I know how many here are not higher ed? They're nonprofits? Yeah, okay. Most of my examples obviously I'm going to be talking about alumni. I want you to be thinking about constituents in your database, because data mining can be used at institutions of any size, and it's depending on the robustness of your database, it can be used by nonprofits as well. Then I'm going to talk about, get all philosophical about what the nature, the essence of modeling data is, and how it differs from what I call everyday data, the kind of data that would be used in, say, reporting. And 3, talk about the role that, the responsibilities that we all play all the way from data entry to database managers to IT to end users to protect the data and to use it wisely and responsibly. Data mining is I consider it a general term. I use it very often because it's a buzzword. It's fairly well known, but I think data mining is not specific enough. Data mining is finding patterns or detecting patterns in large databases. I prefer to use the term predictive modeling, which I define as the creation of a model which assigns specific scores to the constituents in your database, which ranks them in order of their propensity to engage in a specific behavior of interest. And the behavior of interest I'm usually interested in, being a fundraiser, is propensity to give to Dalhousie. But that's not the only model I make. You can create new models by changing the question that you're trying to answer, and I'll list some of those later. Essentially, I'm not going to get into any technical detail about predictive modeling. I do give presentations that focus on specifics of predictive modeling, but I just want you to understand kind of what the basics are. A predictive model is essentially an equation. On one side, you'll have the thing that you're trying to predict, your y, and on the other side, you'll have all kinds of other attributes in the database that pertain to the individuals in your database. So we'll have giving on one side, and then we'll have all these other things. I actually look at about 100 or 120 different variables in our database, which might relate to giving. So, you know, whether we have employment data, how many events they've attended, how many position updates that they have in the database, whether we have a business phone number for them, whether their business phone is their preferred phone, on and on and on and on. You can get very creative in digging in and finding new predictor variables. A key part of predictive modeling is that we're going to use this for segmentation, we're going to use this for prospect identification, but the key thing is we're not looking at giving history. We are liberated from looking at giving history. For example, consider Jade's donor. He had practically no giving whatsoever. And yet, here he turns around and makes this gigantic gift, and all along, he never lost his love for Dalhousie University. Yet, he was totally flying under the radar. If we were looking at prospect identification only according to his past giving history, we would never, ever have reached out to that person. Yes, prospect researchers were aware that he was a wealthy individual, that he had made large gifts in the past to other universities, but this person lived very far from Dalhousie, and we don't exactly have a lot of alumni out here, and the chances that person would ever have been touched are slim. I'm not going to read all this. Normally, when I present, like I say, I usually focus on one aspect of data mining. And each of these is a 90-minute presentation or a full-day workshop. But I will say that the first step in the process, just getting all your data together, assembling it, cleaning it, putting it in a form, trying to account for missing data, will take up perhaps 90% of the time in creating a model. Excuse me, I had caught a cold on the airplane, so folks in the front row. And those will come from many different sources. Not just the central database, which is Banner is what we use, but also Campus Call. I have contact data for all our alumni going back to 2007. As far as I know, before I arrived at Dalhousie, we made no use of historic contact information. You just close off one calling project, open up a new calling project, and that data would just sit there and would not be accessed. But actually, the number of times an alum has actually picked up the phone in response to a call from a student, or the amount of time they've spent on the phone with a student, actually ended up being a significant predictor for my major giving model. I mean, who could have? It's very non-intuitive. Who would put these two things together? But in other sources, there'll be survey data, perhaps some external data as well, market research data. The end result is once I've built my model, I'll just output the scores. So every constituent in the database, or at least I mostly model on alums, every alum will have a very granular score. And that allows me to rank every single individual, and once you count the lost alumni, we're talking about 80,000 alumni. I can rank them from most likely to give to least likely to give, or depending on the model, most likely to attend an event to least likely to attend an event. This is not terrifically useful in annual giving because I want to be able to put people into large groups. So what I do is I divide the entire population by score into 10 equal groups. Those are called deciles. So in the software I use, if you're in the first decile, that's your lowest score possible, very unlikely to give, up to 10, which is the highest score decile. So this will factor into some charts that I'll show you later. Another point about predictive modeling, it's not about picking winners, it's about probability. It's about saying, this decile, I believe, is the most likely to participate by mail this year. Or this group we should not send mail to or call because they are not going to participate. So how do I use the scores? Here's our kids again. Anyone who runs a phone program will tell you that it is getting harder and harder and harder to raise money on the phone because people will not pick up the phone, and it seems to be getting worse and worse every single year. So we need to use resources very wisely. We need to call the people who are most likely to give first and persist with those segments as long as possible. The unfortunate thing is that does not mean just calling donors. We also need to think about the long-term health of the program. We have to call non-donors. So we need tools to allow us to decide, well, which non-donors should we be calling? And I think most programs will just randomly call and just try to reach as many people as possible. Our institutions are getting too big, our budgets are getting too small in order for us to continue to think that that is sustainable. We need to rationalize it somewhat, and predictive modeling is excellent for that. Last year, about 1,000 people were called 20 times or more, and we never reached them. So it just goes to show how hard it is to get a hold of people. So last year, I built my predictive model for propensity to give by phone. It was phone specific, and that was created in the summer of 2010. Implemented it in September. And what it allowed me to do was we actually grew dollars in pledges and gifts by 7%, and I also shaved a month off the calling program. So we saved significantly on long-distance bills, student salaries, and yet grew the program. So that's what we did last year. So I have high hopes for this year as well. This also allowed us to free up Phonathon to serve other constituencies on campus. For example, we did event calling for alumni of the alumni office, which I love to do. I love to do event calling because it varies the tasks that students are being asked to do. You're working with your colleagues. Sometimes there might be a division. They're in a different building than we are, so it's great to have that cooperation. And we even reached across campus and we did some calling for recruitment and admissions. We called, students had been accepted to Dalhousie to invite them to information sessions in their cities. That was a very rewarding project, and we would not have been able to do that had we been just continuing to do as we were before, chasing people who are simply not going to give over the phone. So we can't talk about data without sharing a few charts. I don't know if Marilyn would approve of these charts or not. I was thinking to myself during her presentation, did I remove the grid lines or not? No, they're still there. Anyway, yes, I wanted to be very precise, so that's why the grid lines are there. These are participation rates chopped up by score. So this is a percentage of alumni who were contacted, who made a specified dollar pledge, broken down by their score. Okay, so the average pledge rate last year was about 18%. But the top decile, this very special group, had a pledge rate over 35%. So what group do you think I'm going to continue calling through the rest of the year? And again, with Marilyn, there's Marilyn here. Because normally I will take that 10 group and I'll color it green. To be a 10 is very significant. Okay. Oh, another thing to know is those are not past donors. That's a mixture. That's a 50-50 mix of acquisition and renewal. So there's a lot of new donors in there as well. So, big challenge in phone-a-thon, when do you give up calling a segment? If you give up too soon, if the segment is not very well defined, and you still have people who are likely to give in that segment, and you give up on them, you've wasted an opportunity. If you continue to pound away at a segment where they're just not picking up anymore, you're wasting resources. So here are percentage, okay, let me read this so I get it right. Number of pledges that came from alumni who were called 10 or more times before they gave a pledge, broken down by their score. People who are low scores don't even rate. So the 10s, who we called all through the year, started in September, and we were still calling them at the end of March. If we got them on the phone by the end of March, they were still pledging at a fairly decent rate. Not like it was back in September, but there was a reason to keep calling them, because they were more likely to pick up. All right. High scorers are also more likely to give at higher levels. The 10s have a median gift of $75, and the next score level down is a median of $50. This is a chart showing alumni who gave previously, so these are renewal donors, who actually upgraded their pledge. People with high scores are also more likely to upgrade their pledge. And this wasn't a model that was created to predict upgrades. This is a model created just to predict propensity to give at all. But it actually seems to perform in many different functions. And fulfillment rate. People who are high scorers, high affinity for Dalhousie, they're also more likely to actually fulfill on their promise to make a gift. That's what the scores do. Come back. What's the model actually built on? These are some of the top predictors. Sometimes with a model, it's very hard to actually pull out, well, what are the variables that are actually the top predictors, because they all interact with each other, they're all interrelated. Data mining is kind of a messy business where it's very hard to nail down anything about, what are the top influencers of giving. Another secondary point now that occurs to me is that models are not about figuring out what causes giving. Models are only about figuring out what is correlated with giving or associated with giving. Collecting those traits together and figuring out a score based on those correlates or those associated variables.
Can I just clarify again, number of position updates, that's the different jobs that they've had? Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. What is the number of position updates? What does that mean? That's the number of job titles that we've had for them in the database. And it's very significant because we, and this goes to the core of actually what I'm talking about, because in Banner, when we get new job title information, and the primary source of that is through Phone-a-thon, because it's one of the first things that we ask, we're either verifying where they work now, or if we don't have that information, we ask for it. If they provide it, it's associated with giving. A key point is that when we get new job title information, we do not overwrite the old information. We invalidate the old record and create a new one. This is pretty standard data entry practice, maybe not everywhere, but it allows me to go into the database, query on it, and count the number of job, employment records. And having that count, as it turns out in my testing, that it's highly correlated with giving, and it's at the top of the predictors.
Would you please just back up for a second?
Sure.
Finish writing. Very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Just a few more seconds.
I will be collecting the slide decks from the speakers and posting them online as well. So.
Oh, okay.
And we're also videotaping the sessions as well.
Okay. Which you're going to present for no charge.
Yes. Yes.
Number of family cross-references, is that legacy? Is that what that means?
Yes. I guess, yeah, we could call it legacy. Yeah, I narrowed down the number of cross-references to family-related, so we even have cousins. So there's child, parent, grandparent, guardian, all those. The number of those, any kind of family association with Dalhousie is associated with giving. 2 questions next.
Yeah. So with the email address, why is not having Gmail, Yahoo, or Hotmail significant?
Good question. The question is, why is not having a Gmail, Yahoo, or Hotmail address predictive of giving? It's actually anything but one of those addresses. It used to be that if we had an email address present in the database, the fact that it was there was actually predictive of giving, because they've actually given us that information. Email is different now. We have an email address for practically everyone in the database. The fact of the matter is that only a certain percentage of alumni are actually going to open up an email from us, or that email may not be valid. As it turns out, if an email, the email that they provided to us is one of these freebie accounts, it's probably not their primary address. It's not their work address. It's not their home address. It's something that they just give out so that, let's say they're doing the survey or they're whatever, it may not be an address that is something that they're going to keep an eye on. So I found that it didn't make it into the model, but having given us one of those types of addresses is actually a negative predictor. But if you give us anything other than that, it's a positive predictor. Yes?
When you said number of contact restrictions, do you have multiple contact restrictions? What do you mean there? Because
Yes.
in NC State, you just have one contact restriction.
Now, we have a contact restriction for everything. Yeah. Do not call on Wednesday night during the full moon. No, we have a lot of specific types of contact restrictions, and so I just go in and count them. Yeah, and there was one more question.
So can you explain further on that? Does that mean a higher number of contact restrictions means you're more likely to, or less likely to?
That I don't remember. The question was the number of contact restrictions a positive or negative predictor? And I'm guessing it's probably a negative predictor, but to be honest, I can't remember. Sometimes these things can be non-intuitive. Something that you would anticipate to be a positive predictor interacts with another variable and flips it to a negative because it's actually moderating the influence of another variable. So it's just, sometimes these lists are a bit misleading. These lists are also very specific to the institution. You can't just go into your own database and apply this list and expect to do prospect identification. You've got to test these things for the degree of correlation with giving. I said I create a number of different models. A new model I'm creating in Phonathon this year is actually likelihood to pick up the phone. Because I have data going back to 2007, I know exactly how many seconds every alum in the database has spent in conversation with a student at Dalhousie. And I can use that historical information to create a new model that predicts for that specific kind of behavior, picking up the phone. So I do both. I have a model for likelihood to pick up the phone and a model to predict likelihood to make a gift. If I cross those two together, those two specific behaviors, I hope that I will really enrich our ability to focus. I also make models for acquisition mail so that we're slimming down our mailing so that we're not shipping all kinds of money out and not getting a lot back. And also a gift for model for propensity to give at higher levels, which is used in our revamped leadership annual giving program. And I've also created event attendance likelihood models, which are again for slimming down mailings for invites. So now I want to talk about the nature of modeling data. Oscar said this in 1894, and it's truer now than it ever was. It's a key message that I want to leave you with. There's no such thing as dead data. There's no such thing as useless data. Data that we would normally regard as worthless, as flawed, as fragmentary, actually might have value for data mining. And the reason is that it's our ability to extract insight from that data is better now than it ever was before. Where does this data come from? It all comes from all the normal operations of the university. Obviously, gift processing, everything that you'd find in advancement services. Some from the registrar's office. Like I say, some from our historical calling data. Almost all of the 100 predictor variables that I use would come from one of these sources. And I've tossed in a couple of slides for people at nonprofits. I did a little bit of work with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra just to see, because I was curious. I'd never done any predictive modeling outside of higher ed, and I was just wondering, can you actually do this at a nonprofit? And yes, you can. You just need two key things. You have to be able to collect data that matters, that's related to engagement with your cause, engagement with your organization, and you also need to have some kind of robust database that connects different types of data together. And the Toronto Symphony Orchestra was a great example to work with, because they do have this data scattered over more than one database. They have a ticketing database, tracks ticket sales and subscriptions to concert series. They also have a donation database. But the key is that they can relate an individual donor to an individual series subscriber. And when I created a model for them, I found that subscribing to certain concert series was predictive of giving. What I did was I divided up the series according to whether they were Pops concerts or on the lighter fare, or more modern stuff, compared to more of the classics or quote-unquote serious music. And the people who were devoted to serious music tended to be better donors. Perhaps there's an age factor in there, but they didn't have birth dates like we have in university data. They don't have access to that information. So even if it is a proxy for age, it's still a very valuable insight into their donors and their potential donors among their ticket buyers. Some things that matter, these things that matter. Making sure that your database contains the full range of your constituency. So the Toronto Symphony Orchestra has their volunteers, they have their trustees, their boards, their orchestra members are in there as well. Any kind of involvement or engagement, any touch points with the organization are recorded and are also predicted by giving. Covered that. So modeling data and reporting data are essentially the same thing. They look the same, they smell the same, but I think there's a very deep conceptual difference that we must bring when we do analytics as opposed to doing reporting. And I think of the distinction as the difference between insight data and everyday data. When I say everyday data, that's not to diminish the importance of reporting data. It's simply to reinforce that there is a big difference between these two types of data, or at least in the way that we should be thinking about them. And insight data is just my term for it, the modeling data. Everyday data is very focused on accuracy. It's focused on currency, up-to-dateness. It's focused on facts. The statistics that we would use in creating reports and so on is descriptive statistics. And the threshold for validity is much higher with everyday data than it is for insight data. If it's fragmentary, if it's old, if there's something missing, you can't have a mailing list that hasn't been updated since the 1970s. It's useless. You need completeness, or else you're going to throw out the data. Insight data is none of those things. It's a different animal altogether. It's not about finding facts. It's more about exploring for patterns. And if the data is fragmentary or old, that's just fine. We either have techniques for dealing with it, or the very absence of that data is actually predictive. The absence of a business phone for an alum, if we don't have that information, we know that alum is statistically slightly less likely to make a gift. So that's like flipping the predictor on its head. And also think of the number of job title updates. If we had been deleting that information and simply replacing it with the new information, everybody would have exactly 0 or 1 job titles in the database. I'm very fortunate that I can say that they might have 0, 1, 2, 3, or 10 job title updates in the database. Everyday data, I'm going to get into Halloween now. Everyday data has short-term uses with payoffs today. It's valuable today. Insight data may not have payoffs, or may have payoffs that are delayed for decades after the data is created and stored. And it has to be maintained and kept for all that time. And this is why I think that because the payoffs are so far in the future in some cases, not always, but sometimes, insight data is always at risk of being lost. About a year and a half ago, I posed a question on the Prospect DMM listserv. It's hosted at MIT, and it's where lots of data nerds hang out. I love it. And I had a bee in my bonnet about, I was fearful that something was going to happen to the campus call server and that I was going to lose the historic contact data that we had on alumni. I don't know how I got this idea in my head, but I'm just really paranoid. Because I don't manage, that server is in another building. I haven't even met the person who manages it. And so I went into reaction mode, and so I posted on the Prospect DMM listserv, have you ever heard of data that might be useful for modeling that was deliberately deleted? And I was absolutely horrified by the stories that came back to me. I honestly didn't think that this is something that would happen, but it has. And these stories I posted on my blog. There's a lot more detail there, but they fall into 3 main groups. The first one is, first of all, the data was never captured. It was never recognized that maybe it might be important someday. It was never captured. It never made it into the database. The second is data that would have been useful to have, historical data, overwritten with newer data. This is your position updates, your job titles, getting overwritten. Then the final one, the most horrible data that's actually deleted. There's a database conversion happens, and whole masses of your constituency that are regarded as surplus are chucked because they're taking up space. So actually, I just summarized some of the stories, and just to give you a couple of examples of what kinds of things have happened. Data that never gets entered. I heard from a university that did nothing to capture athletic team membership, did nothing to capture other student involvements, student government, all that good stuff, never made it into the database. The university did not have yearbooks. So, gone. Very important engagement-related data that could have been used by a modeler, but never will be. Also, many universities and nonprofit organizations in general do a poor job of capturing event attendance data, reunion data. Did they show up? Did they not? Data that gets overwritten. One database manager deleted all the old addresses that were no longer valid. At another institution, whenever an alum returned to do postgrad work or obtain their second degree, their original degree was overwritten. I'm not sure if that's even legal to do. It happened. And finally, the deliberate destruction of data. One database administrator needed to free up space, so the records of deceased alumni were deleted. They never existed. This caused a lot of original records regarding estate gifts or endowments to be lost. That's bad. On another case, his storage space was limited. This seems to be a common excuse. One organization did a huge purge of information. The records of all non-donors and parents of alumni were removed. One university established in the 1930s underwent several database conversions. During those conversions, the following things happened. Those who attended but did not receive a degree were not transferred to the new database. They don't count. We have, non-degree donors. So. People who died or had no valid address were not transferred. All the female, here's the weird one, all the female constituents' middle names were overwritten with their unmarried names when they married. So happy Halloween. So this is the continuum of malfeasance. I like to think that some of the reasons for data losses are sort of at the more benign end of the scale, like it costs money to maintain servers. Although the cost of keeping data for years should be cheaper now than it's ever been, wouldn't you say? I don't know. I'm not an IT person. Is lack of storage space really an excuse anymore? No. Okay. Good. And then deliberate sabotage. I don't think that ever actually happened. But I just think of the cumulative effect of all these losses. I couldn't imagine if any of those things had actually happened at our university, would a JADE project ever have a chance of getting off the ground? Like, that potential donor would never have been contacted if we didn't know that he had student involvements and things like that, engagement-related stuff. We need to remember that data is not just part of the technology. Nobody owns the data. IT does not own the data. The server manager people, they don't own the data. The data is an institutional asset. It's like the buildings. It's the campus. It is, and I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys don't, you know this already. It's an institutional asset. Nobody has the right. I don't have the right. I work in annual giving, but I don't have the right to say this data is now useless and we're going to get rid of it. No, it's an institutional asset. The servers and hard drives are replaceable, but data, when it's gone forever. And the problem with it is that you can't put a value on the data that's lost because we just don't know what we were going to be able to do with it in the future. So now I'm going to move in the direction of talking about the final part of what I want to talk about, kind of fostering a culture of analytics. Analytics is something that's really gaining a foothold at universities. Nonprofits are going to come on stream eventually. They're going to get some of this and do it in-house. And I want to talk about the ability to do it in-house especially. But at the very minimum, we absolutely need to protect the data. One bright moment in going through these data horror stories is that I realized that most of them happened about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. None of them were really recent. Maybe it was too sensitive to actually complain on the listserv or in an email to me, but I like to think that we've gotten a lot better, across institutions at recognizing that the data needs to be protected. Second, in order to get closer to analytics culture, we need to provide the tools. We need to provide software. We need to provide access to the data. We need to provide training on how to query the data, the database. In annual giving, probably, we would have mostly relied on advancement services to produce reports, a lot of ad hoc reports. We're taking more and more of that, doing it in-house, getting better at, running our own data. This frees up the data specialists and advancement services to do perhaps more challenging, interesting, valuable work, such as creating sophisticated dashboards and leaving more of the ad hoc stuff to us. At least if we are better able to develop our own queries, maybe they're not going to be as sophisticated as something that would be built for us, but when we do ask for something to be built, we will actually know what we're asking for. Communication, obviously very important. At Dalhousie, we have semi-regular meetings of all data users. This ranges from, in external relations, this ranges from people who actually do data entry, to prospect research, to people who work in annual giving. Anybody who touches the data, from creator of the data to the end user, gets together, and the meetings are not always, they're not always useful, but I always come away with some tiny nugget of information that I didn't have before, some idea for a new variable that I could use, some new knowledge about some obscure code in the database that gift processing uses that I have no idea what it means, because I don't want to be using data in my models if I don't know what it means. Because sometimes something will look like a wonderful predictor, but it's really just a proxy for what I'm trying to predict, and it'll poison my model and in a way that I don't want it to happen. So I have to know, I have to understand the data. So we have to communicate with each other. I put a lot of stress on documentation as well. Data work requires documentation. Code sets, we got to know what they mean. If you have built a report, we have to know how you built it. It's just very important, and I think we struggle with that. I mean, Dalhousie struggles with that. I think everybody struggles with that, maybe. And I think it's important to innovate from within. We're not going to have the ability to reach out and hire statistics PhDs or people with a lot of experience in analytics. I stumbled into analytics. I discovered a passion for working with data from a very unlikely source. My degree is in journalism. I worked as a reporter and a magazine writer and editor for years, and then I got into communications at a small university. Then I got into prospect research, which I did for 5 years. Somehow stumbled into working with data, got training from Peter Wiley and John Samus, and everything just seemed to catch on fire from there. I was building models for a university that had 30,000 living alumni. The models were very elegant and they worked very well. You don't need a huge institution in order to do data mining. Now I'm at Dalhousie, which is considerably larger than the university where I started, which is called St. Francis Xavier University, and I'm having a lot of fun playing with the data there. Everyone in fundraising seems to be really interested in analytics. It's kind of a buzzword, but there's a number of barriers that kind of stand between getting from being fascinated with the idea to actually making it, to actually building your own models. And yesterday I had the opportunity to see a model built for planned giving at the University of Washington, and I was very impressed by what they were doing in-house. They did everything right, and I'm really gratified to see when that kind of innovation is actually happening without always, we need to hire, not to have anything against vendors, but sometimes you can develop solutions within your own institution. The barriers, I think, are sort of threefold. You have to get to learn your data in a new way, think about your data in a different way. You have to usually learn to use a statistical software package. You have to learn data mining concepts, which is not the same thing as learning about statistics. Data mining is predictive modeling is a very specialized use of statistics. A statistics textbook is not always very helpful in learning how to do predictive modeling. There are not a lot of resources out there for learning to do predictive modeling in a fundraising environment or a university environment or a nonprofit environment. The blog is one attempt to somehow fill in some gaps. But I think the individual employee is where it all begins, despite all those barriers. So whether I'm talking to people who are employers or managers or directors, or whether I'm talking to would-be practitioners in analytics, I think about 5 different steps that might get individual employees closer to actually doing analytics. The thing about analytics, I have never seen it happen that it's identified as an institutional priority that trickles down to staff. This may not be a universal, but other people have told me this as well. It's usually individual employees, often prospect researchers, who are plugged into some technology. They develop an interest in working with data at a sophisticated level, and they end up selling it to upper management, if they're successful. Not always successful. So I think it can start with individual employees. So how can our organizations actually encourage this activity? I always think of the famous example of Google and the 20% the 20% of their job time or work hours that are set aside for personal projects. I don't think we're going to be setting aside 20% of our time to do our own little thing, but I think there's ways that you can adapt that idea to the nonprofit world. For example, when I was a prospect researcher, The summer times were fairly quiet. The president was on vacation. There weren't a lot of development calls happening. I was a very reactive researcher. I was developing, long profiles, donor profiles or prospect profiles. And in the summertime, things would kind of ebb. And of course, I'd be encouraged to take my vacation then. I think it's a bad idea to force creative employees to take vacations at certain times of the year, because it's in those long stretches of unstructured time that some new ideas, new innovations might actually occur. If you're always on a treadmill, it's going to be that much harder to do something innovative. And that's when I discovered data mining, got into reading Peter Wiley's stuff online, reading his book, and so on. My boss had no clue what I was up to. Now it's my job. Freedom is wonderful, but it should be tied to business goals. If you're the would-be practitioner, you're going to have a lot more success if what you're proposing is actually tied to something that's in the annual plan, or tied to, maybe this will help us reach our target. Here's a new way of doing something which, all of the organization's hopes and fears are kind of encapsulated in the strategic plan for the year. Annual giving has a plan with a bunch of different targets and so on. The creative worker has to keep that plan in mind and tie whatever they're doing back to that. If you're an employer, find interesting challenges for your creative employees. If you are a creative employee, search for interesting challenges. And actually, they're obviously not hard to find. There's lots of them out there. Innovation is all about finding new ways to do work, especially work that's a drudgery. And, trying to automate work, essentially being lazy in a creative way. This conference is an excellent example of reaching out to other organizations. The point was made earlier that a lot of people are, especially working in analytics, tend to work in isolation within their own institution, and that's definitely true of myself. There are not many people in my department that I can turn to and discuss anything on a technical level. So I obviously rely on online resources. Conferences are very important. So if you're an employer, definitely encourage employees to attend conferences. Make sure that they're involved in professional organizations, and the University of Washington reaching out this is the best example of reaching out across institutions. The end users. I started out by saying that I'm the end user of my own product. So that's an ideal, well, maybe it's not perfectly ideal because I don't have enough time, but the fundraisers have to, for example, if they're the end user, they have to have some confidence that your model isn't just a bunch of mumbo-jumbo, and it's actually it's something that's going to help them be successful. So there has to be the two-way communication happening all the time. This is not just about buy-in, getting buy-in. It's also about keeping your analytics work relevant to the organization, so that what you're doing is answering the questions that need to be answered, solving the problems that need to be solved. For example, in Phonathon, the problem isn't necessarily the difficulty in getting a specified pledge from a donor. The problem is identifying who's actually going to take the call. Because once we get them on the phone, the student can then use all their skills on the call to get that pledge. So what's the business question? The first business question, the part of the funnel that's being squeezed is actually identifying who's going to pick up the phone. So since I'm the end user and the modeler, I identify the problem that I want to solve, create the model to do it. That's kind of a tight circle. It's obviously not always that tight. So I'm done. The very existence and the quality of the data that we work with is our responsibility, all the way from data entry to the end user. So, if we take our responsibilities seriously, we can have all kinds of examples in our own institutions of JADE projects. Is there any questions? Oh, okay, I'll start here because I saw you first.
So, do you work like 90 hours a week? Because this is a lot of effort.
I think about this 90 hours a week. Yeah. Yeah. And,
I guess the real question there is,
yeah.
are you achieving the efficiencies to enable yourself the time for this?
I don't think so. I think I need to get, I obviously have to organize my time well. I have a very set window during the course of the year where I will do most of my model creation. I would like to stagger that and do more model creation more often. So I will renew models once a year. I'd like to do more models more often, but I'm constrained by, the daily tasks involved in raising money. Yeah,
So for an organization starting out in data modeling like this, how do you ensure that, how do you validate, how does an organization validate the model? So let's say you created, we've done some and they require a lot of effort, and similar to your situation, it's kind of one person who's interested in it. And now they're in place. But so when do we revisit it? When do we say, okay, this model is actually predicting something, or it's wrong, and where is it wrong?
Right. The question is, at what stage or how do you validate your efforts in predictive modeling to figure out whether what you're doing is worth all the effort, worth the time and investment? That's a tough one. I will often take a look, well, for example, the charts I showed you with Phonathon, and just see, well, did our donors, how did they break down by score? And that's, I found, is the most convincing evidence that I can use. I'm not called on very often to produce evidence for how the models are working. And other predictive modelers I've spoken to say that they don't do a lot of testing after the fact to see whether the models actually worked. I always test. I always see how they performed. That's how I discovered that one model I created wasn't really doing a very good job. For example, this very general Phonathon model did a very poor job of predicting young alum acquisition, because the model was too general. So this year I've split the model into young alumni and all other alumni, non-donors. So because they're two very different populations. So it's really a constant reevaluation that has to happen. As far as return on investment goes, I'm not sure how you would do that. I don't know. Sorry.
In earlier you have an equation and a score and then different variables, and then later on you have a slide with kind of like a list of priorities. How do you take like dozens of variables and turn it down to those small lists?
I use, well, there's a lot of different techniques. The techniques I use are fairly simple, not as sophisticated as some of the things out there, but I look at Pearson correlation values and I rank them according to their strength of linear correlation, and then I will introduce them to a regression model, one by one, ranked in order according to how strongly correlated they are with the dependent variable. And then I just, when R squared fails to improve, or I keep hitting a lot of insignificant variables that are not adding any extra explanatory power to the model, I'll stop. And usually I'll stop around 20 variables, 25 variables. That's kind of a technical answer. The question was, how do you select the variables that are actually going to make it in the model? Because you start with potentially hundreds, and yet the number of variables that end up in the model is fairly small. The reason why it's fairly small is because all these variables are actually related to each other. They're not fully independent of each other. So the more variables you keep adding in, the less explanatory power they're going to have, and eventually you're just adding random noise to your model. But the software takes care of so much of the decision-making about which variables to add.
What software do you use?
What software do you use? I use Datadesk, which is a fairly powerful statistics software package. There are other, there's quite a lot of variety out there. SPSS is something that is available to staff members at most universities. Minitab is another one. Excel is not really adequate for handling really large data sets, I don't think.
I was going to mention that the software does, pick out those variables for you.
Yeah, absolutely. My modeling method is fairly manual. There are other software packages that automate a lot of the data cleanup and assembly and decision making for you, and you can use stepwise regression, which will build a model for you.
And you can clearly see why you would want to pop open the hood and Two things I'm curious about is, one, how you account for or resolve echo. I know you mentioned, that the type of what they subscribe to with the arts organization is maybe reflective of their age, and so it's kind of an echo effect. Do you have a methodology for figuring that out? And then my second question is, I think in doing our modeling, it really helped to know something about the source and the origin and the quality of the data. So are there people that you partner with in your organization to figure out, how good is this? How comprehensive is this? Is there a story behind this?
Yeah.
How this data was acquired that I need to be aware of?
Yeah. Yeah. Data mining is a couple of questions, but I'll address one of the questions is what kind of work do you have to do to ensure to learn more about the provenance of the data? What's the story behind it? What does it mean? How has it changed over time so that you really understand what you're using? Data mining is partly about sitting in front of the computer and geeking out, and it's also about picking up the phone and calling people in gift processing, calling people who who own different parts of the data, and talk to them. Well, what does this code mean? How well populated is this variable? I had a perfect example and it slipped my mind, but things change over time, so you have to understand what you're looking at. I don't know if I really answered your question, and I think we're actually, well, it's lunchtime. Can I take one more? Okay.
I worked for higher ed for a while. I don't work in higher ed now, but I used to in admissions recruiting. And you created a model to target the student who's most likely to enroll. And one thing I noticed was that that worked well to identify those prospects who had the highest probability to enroll, but it excluded another large group of people, because our organization wanted to change and become more competitive. And what we found was that the model identified kind of the student in the middle as the most likely, not the highest performer, not the lowest performer, but the middle. And if our recruiters were only attempting to recruit those students within the middle, our organization wasn't going to grow. So I'm just curious to know how you kind of balance the prescriptive versus descriptive kind of issue.
Yeah, the question is generally, if I understand it correctly, that, for example, sometimes your model will suggest a certain course of action which may not be what your actual goal is. And the specific example was a student recruitment model where actually your middle achievers were identified as your most likely to attend.
Two goals. One, we definitely want to target students who are likely to enroll for sure.
Yeah.
But also, two, our organization wanted to change a little bit, become more competitive. And the model wasn't pointing us to those students. It was pointing us to students in the middle, not the students who are at the top here.
Right.
So when we think about efforts and where we focus our efforts, if we were only using that one model, we would be kind of excluding
Exactly.
other students. So how do you balance?
Yeah, data mining does not tell you the course of action. Data mining informs and guides your course of action. So you need to perhaps model, break out those high achievers and create a model only for them and choose the high scores from them, or have a matrix where you have high achievers and their scores like this, and maybe you could get focused in that way. I don't know. Without looking at the data, I'm not sure what.
Actually, that sounds
Okay. We're done. And we're hungry.